Three friends went for a swim, but 15 years later, a fisherman found something that made him immediately call the police. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Marina Alvarez's small Naples apartment, casting golden stripes across her photographs mounted on the wall, stunning images of Florida's wetlands and wildlife that had finally started garnering professional recognition. At 6:30 in the morning on July 17, 2008, Marina performed her daily ritual, brewing Colombian coffee the way her mother had taught her. Strong, sweet, and aromatic enough to fill the entire apartment. Her slender fingers wrapped around the warm mug as she settled at her desk, opening her laptop to check emails. A smile spread across her face when she saw the confirmation from Florida Wildlife Monthly. They wanted to use her Everglades series for their next issue. At 26, Marina was finally seeing her photography career take flight after years of dedication, countless unpaid assignments, and early mornings chasing perfect light. She tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear as she dialed her mother's number. "Mama?" Marina said, switching effortlessly to rapid Spanish, explaining her plans for the day while carefully arranging camera lenses in her equipment bag. "I'm heading to the Peace River with the twins. There's this secluded spot Eric mentioned. They call it Blind Point. The light should be perfect there this afternoon." Carmen Alvarez's voice carried both pride and the ever-present maternal concern. "Just be careful near the water, mi amor. And call me when you're heading back, yes?" After promising to return before dinner, Marina ended the call and turned her attention to a small black notebook where she meticulously detailed shooting locations. Her neat handwriting filled the pages with coordinates, lighting notes, and small sketches of potential compositions for the Peace River trip. In the margins of one page, she had written something that seemed out of place among the photography notes. "Ask E about notebook?" Underlined twice. At 9:15, Marina pushed open the door to Sunrise Brew, the local coffee shop where she had arranged to meet the Walsh twins. The familiar bell chimed as she entered, immediately spotting Eric and Dylan at their usual corner table. Though identical in appearance, with their curly brown hair and athletic builds, the 26-year-old twins couldn't have been more different in demeanor. Eric gestured animatedly as he spoke, his eyes bright with excitement, while Dylan listened quietly, occasionally nodding. "The Blind Point is incredible," Eric was saying as Marina approached. "Almost nobody goes there. The rock formations create these amazing natural pools, and the light reflects off the water in ways you wouldn't believe." Marina set down her camera bag and slid into the chair across from them. "Sounds perfect. How long is the hike from the parking area?" "About 45 minutes, Dylan said, his voice softer than his brother's. "But it's worth it." During their conversation, Marina casually brought up something that had been bothering her. "Eric, I saw a notebook in your backpack last week when I was looking for my spare battery. Lots of names and numbers. Looked important." A flicker of tension crossed Eric's face before he quickly changed the subject, throwing a meaningful glance at his brother. "Just work stuff, boring boat sales records. Hey, did you hear back from that magazine?" At 10:23, Marina pulled her green Jeep Wrangler into a gas station on Route 41. The twins waited in the vehicle while she filled the tank, chatting easily with Roger Simmons, the attendant she knew from her frequent photography trips. "Another adventure with the Walsh boys?" Roger asked, nodding toward the Jeep where the twins were engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. "We're heading to Peace River today," Marina replied, her sunglasses perched atop her messy bun. "I'm hoping to capture some of those rock formations for the state park brochure they're commissioning." In the Jeep's rearview mirror, Marina caught a glimpse of Eric and Dylan whispering to each other, their expressions serious. When they noticed her watching, Eric immediately broke into a smile, and Dylan looked away. A flicker of concern passed through Marina's mind, but she dismissed it, focusing instead on the day ahead. By 11:45, they had arrived at the nature reserve entrance. Marina paid the parking fee in cash, receiving a map and a warning from the park ranger about strong currents near Blind Point. She signed the visitor log, indicating they planned to return by 4 o'clock, while Eric nervously checked his phone. "Everything okay?" Marina asked. "Yeah, just checking the weather," Eric replied too quickly. "All clear for today." As they set off down the trail at noon, a family having a picnic near the entrance observed the trio walking by, Marina leading the way with determination, camera, equipment slung over her shoulder, the identical twins following with their own backpacks. The midday sun filtered through the canopy of trees as they made their way deeper into the reserve. Marina paused occasionally to photograph interesting rock formations, the click of her camera echoing in the natural quiet. Dylan watched her with admiration as she worked, while Eric repeatedly checked his watch, growing increasingly impatient. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Marina sent a final text message to her mother. "At Peace River with the twins. Should be back before dinner. I'll call you later." This would be the last communication anyone would receive from Marina Alvarez. When they finally reached Blind Point, Marina gasped at the beauty of the secluded area. Impressive rock formations created small natural pools surrounded by dense vegetation, with the sound of the river current dominating the atmosphere. She quickly set up her professional Canon camera on a tripod, her face alternating between professional concentration and subtle concern, as she observed the twins engaged in intense conversation several meters away. As she adjusted her camera settings, Marina accidentally captured an image of the Walsh brothers exchanging a small package between them. Her blood froze when, zooming in on the digital display, she recognized what appeared to be a plastic bag containing white powder, confirming her worst suspicions about the activities the twins had been hiding from her. Marina's hands trembled as she stared at the digital display of her camera. The image left no room for doubt. Eric and Dylan were involved in something dangerous, something illegal. She quickly lowered the camera, pretending she hadn't seen anything, her mind racing with what to do next. The sound of approaching footsteps made her heart pound faster as Eric called out, "Getting any good shots?" His voice carried its usual casual confidence, but Marina now detected an undercurrent of tension she'd never noticed before. "The light on these rock formations is perfect," she replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I'm going to move closer to the water for a different angle." As Marina adjusted her tripod, creating distance between herself and the twins, she realized her day had transformed from a photography expedition into something far more dangerous. She needed time to think, to figure out how to extract herself from this situation safely. At 6:45 that evening, Carmen Alvarez stood in her kitchen, phone pressed against her ear, listening to Marina's voicemail message for the fourth time. The wall clock showed it was well past the time her daughter had promised to return. Carmen's fingers tapped nervously on the counter as she dialed another number. "Patricia? It's Carmen Alvarez," she said when the call connected. "Have you heard from the boys? Marina isn't answering her phone, and they were supposed to be back by now." Patricia Walsh's voice carried a hint of concern. "I haven't heard from them either. But you know how they get when they're out on these trips, probably lost track of time, or they're in an area with no signal." "Marina always calls when she's running late," Carmen insisted, her worry growing. "She knows I worry." By 10 o'clock that night, Carmen and Javier Alvarez sat at their kitchen table, debating whether to contact authorities. Javier had just returned from a business trip to Miami, his face lined with exhaustion and growing concern. "We should wait until morning," Javier suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Remember when they camped overnight at Everglades National Park last year?" Marina called the next day, apologizing for forgetting to let us know their plans had changed. Carmen repeatedly checked the location app on her phone, growing increasingly frustrated as Marina's device continued to show as unavailable. Sleep evaded both parents that night, with Carmen checking her phone every few minutes, hoping for a message that didn't come. At 7:30 the next morning, July 18th, Javier drove his black sedan along Route 41 toward the nature reserve, his knuckles white with tension as he gripped the steering wheel. The rising sun cast long shadows across the road as he rehearsed what to say to the park rangers, trying to sound concerned but not panicked, though panic was exactly what he felt building inside his chest. By 8:15, Javier pulled into the reserve's parking lot, immediately spotting Marina's distinctive green Jeep Wrangler. A wave of relief washed over him, quickly followed by renewed anxiety when he approached the vehicle and found it locked and empty. Peering through the windows, he could see 3 neatly folded towels on the back seat, a half-empty bottle of sunscreen in the center console, and Marina's backup photography equipment in the trunk. "Where are you, mija?" he whispered, scanning the nearly empty parking lot for any sign of his daughter or the Walsh twins. At 9:30, Javier's voice had grown desperate as he explained the situation to Kevin Murray, the park ranger at the administration building. Murray immediately contacted the sheriff's department, his experienced eyes betraying concern despite his professional reassurances. "Happens more often than you'd think, sir," Murray said. "People lose track of time, camp overnight, sometimes hike out to a different exit point. But we'll get search teams organized right away." By 11 o'clock, Officer Brian Thompson had arrived at the reserve, a middle-aged, stocky man with a weathered face and a small notebook in his hand. He asked detailed questions about Marina and the Walsh twins, jotting down descriptions and last known contacts. "And you're certain they were headed to this Blind Point area?" Thompson asked, examining the visitor logbook where Marina's neat signature confirmed her intended destination and expected return time. "That's what Marina told her mother," Javier confirmed. "She specifically mentioned it in her last text message." At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a preliminary search team consisting of 6 forest rangers and Officer Thompson began making their way along the trail to Blind Point, calling out the names of the missing trio. The summer heat had intensified, creating a humid blanket that made the search even more challenging. Carmen arrived at the reserve shortly after, embracing Javier tightly as they watched the growing activity of official vehicles and search teams gathering at the trailhead. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but her face showed steely determination. "They'll find them," Javier assured her, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. By 4:45, a forest ranger radioed in the first significant discovery. Marina's backpack had been found on a rock about 20 meters from the riverbank, its blue fabric slightly stained with mud. The news sent Carmen and Javier rushing to the search coordination center that had been established near the park entrance. Officer Thompson carefully emptied the contents of the backpack onto a plastic sheet. Marina's phone powered off, her wallet with ID and credit cards intact, and her photography notebook filled with location ideas and composition notes. Conspicuously absent was her professional Canon camera, the equipment she treasured most and rarely let out of her sight. "The battery's dead," a technician reported after examining Marina's phone. "We'll charge it and check for any messages or photos that might help us understand what happened." By 7 o'clock, as the sun began to set, Carmen and Javier stood at the reserve entrance, now illuminated by portable floodlights. They watched divers preparing to enter the water the following morning, their faces reflecting the grim possibility that the search might take a darker turn. "We should have called someone sooner," Carmen whispered, her voice breaking. "We wasted so much time." As Officer Thompson consulted with the dive team leader about the search operation that would begin at dawn, the radio on his belt crackled with an urgent message. A fisherman had just reported finding a professional camera lodged between rocks approximately 1 kilometer downstream from Blind Point. The fisherman's discovery sent a wave of urgency through the search operation. By 5:30 the next morning, as dawn broke over the Peace River, divers entered the still dark waters, their underwater flashlights creating beams of light beneath the surface. Along the riverbanks, search dogs and their handlers formed a methodical line, carefully examining every inch of ground. Detective Maria Ramirez, a 42-year-old investigator with Mexican heritage and a determined expression, examined the damaged camera inside an evidence bag. The Canon professional model had been recovered late the previous night, its black casing scratched and waterlogged from its time in the river. "Can we recover anything from the memory card?" she asked the forensic technician who stood beside her. "Possibly," the technician replied. "Water damage is extensive, but these professional-grade cards are surprisingly resilient. We'll need specialized equipment back at the lab." By 9:15 that morning, Detective Robert Dawson, a 50-year-old veteran with deep-set eyes and permanent shadows beneath them, was interviewing Roger Simmons, the gas station attendant who had seen Marina and the Walsh twins just before their disappearance. "They seem normal, you know. Excited about their trip," Roger explained, leaning against the counter of the Route 41 gas station. Marina was chatting about some rock formations she wanted to photograph. Nothing seemed off. "And the Walsh brothers?" Dawson pressed. "How did they appear?" Roger thought for a moment. "Now that you mention it, they stayed in the car. Usually they come in for snacks or something, but that day they just waited while Marina filled up the Jeep." At the makeshift operations center near the reserve entrance, a table had been set up with photographs of Marina and the Walsh twins side by side. Maps of the area were spread out with colored pins, marking the locations where Marina's backpack and camera had been found. Timeline charts were being meticulously constructed based on witness statements and the last known communications. At 11:30, Detective Ramirez sat across from Luke Bennett, Marina's ex-boyfriend and fellow photographer, in a local cafe. His expression visibly changed when she inquired about the Walsh brothers. "Marina called me about 3 weeks ago," Luke revealed, stirring his untouched coffee. "She sounded nervous, which was unusual for her. Said she'd found something strange in Eric's backpack, some notebook with numbers and names that didn't make sense to her." Ramirez leaned forward. "Did she elaborate on what she thought it might be?" "No, but she was troubled by it," Luke replied. "Marina had this intuition about people. If something felt off to her, there was usually a reason." Early that afternoon, Detective Dawson arrived at the Walsh family home, a spacious 2-story house in one of Naples' affluent neighborhoods. The contrast between the Alvarez and Walsh families was immediately apparent. While Carmen and Javier Alvarez openly displayed their distress, Patricia and Richard Walsh answered questions with measured responses, their emotions tightly controlled. Richard Walsh, a successful 55-year-old boat dealership owner with silver-streaked hair and an imposing presence, abruptly interrupted the interview to answer a phone call. Stepping out of the room, he murmured something about, "Our lawyer is on his way," before disappearing down the hallway. Meanwhile, forensic technicians were carefully working to dry and access the memory card from Marina's camera, connecting it to specialized equipment designed to recover data from damaged devices. The process was painstakingly slow, requiring patience and precision to avoid further damage to the fragile electronic components. At 4:45 that afternoon, Detective Ramirez sat in Marina's apartment with Sofia Torres, Marina's closest friend. Tears streamed down Sofia's face as she showed Ramirez text messages from the weeks before Marina's disappearance. "Look at this one," Sofia said, pointing to a particular message. She wrote, "I think Eric is involved in something dangerous. Dylan seems scared. I need to figure out what's going on before someone gets hurt." "When was this sent?" Ramirez asked, taking a photo of the message with her department-issued phone. 10 days before she disappeared," Sofia replied. "I told her to be careful, but Marina always believed in confronting problems directly." By 6:30 that evening, Detectives Dawson and Ramirez reconvened at the operations center to share their findings with Officer Thompson and the search team leader. A detailed map now showed areas that had been thoroughly searched, with red marks indicating where Marina's belongings had been found. "The preliminary interviews are raising some red flags," Ramirez explained. "Multiple sources indicate Marina was concerned about Eric Walsh's behavior in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. And we've discovered some financial irregularities in Eric's bank records," Dawson added. "Large cash withdrawals with no clear purpose." At 8 o'clock that night, Carmen and Javier were in Marina's apartment, methodically organizing information that might help the investigation. Carmen arranged photos and contact information for Marina's friends to provide to the detectives, while Javier examined his daughter's personal computer for any clues. "Marina was always so organized," Carmen said softly, touching a framed photograph of her daughter. "She would want us to be thorough." Later that evening, Andrew Caldwell, a high-profile attorney retained by the Walsh family, arrived at the sheriff's department. With an expensive suit and commanding presence, he demanded to be informed of all investigation details before his clients answered any further questions. "The Walsh family is devastated by the disappearance of their sons and Marina," Caldwell stated. "But they also have rights that must be respected during this process." At 11:15 that night, Detective Ramirez received an urgent call from the forensic lab, informing her that they had partially recovered some images from the memory card, including photos taken on the day of the disappearance. Abandoning her plans to return home for a few hours of sleep, she drove directly to the lab. In the darkened room of the forensic laboratory, Ramirez intently observed the first recovered images from Marina's camera, her body stiffening when the sequence showed not only river landscapes, but also what appeared to be a heated argument between Eric and Dylan Walsh beside a rock formation, with Eric holding what undeniably looked like a small package of drugs. Detective Ramirez stared at the damning images on the computer screen, her mind racing with implications. The sequence clearly showed Eric Walsh holding what forensic analysts would later confirm was approximately 100 grams of cocaine, worth around $5,000 on the street. 1 week after Marina's disappearance, this discovery transformed what began as a missing persons case into something far more complex and sinister. At 8 o'clock the following morning, Ramirez and Dawson presented the recovered photos to Captain Reynolds in the investigation room at the sheriff's department. The captain's expression grew increasingly grave as he examined the enlarged image of the package in Eric's hands. "This changes everything," Reynolds said, rubbing his forehead. "We need to look deeper into the Walsh brothers' activities and connections." By 9:30 that morning, Detective Dawson was at SunTrust Bank, reviewing Eric Walsh's banking statements obtained through a judicial warrant. The records revealed a troubling pattern of large cash withdrawals over the previous 6 months, often followed by periods of unusual spending or, more concerning, complete financial silence. "He withdrew $12,000 just 3 weeks before the disappearance," Dawson muttered to himself, making notes in his weathered notebook. Across town, Detective Ramirez was interviewing Dylan Walsh's former employer at the Blue Depths Diving School. The manager, a tanned man in his 50s, shifted uncomfortably in his chair as he explained the circumstances of Dylan's dismissal. "We had to let him go after a client reported that Dylan had used one of our boats for an unauthorized nighttime excursion," he explained reluctantly. When confronted, he claimed he was just showing some friends the bioluminescence in the bay, but the boat's GPS showed it went much farther out, near some of the coastal channels rarely used by recreational vessels. At 1 o'clock that afternoon, a helicopter circled over more remote areas of Peace River, thermal cameras scanning the dense vegetation below. On the ground, volunteers formed a search line along the riverbanks, standing 20 meters apart from each other as they methodically combed through the underbrush and shallow water areas. In Marina's apartment, Carmen was carefully decorating missing person posters with photos of the trio. Her eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but her movements were precise and determined. Phones rang constantly in the background as friends, family, and now journalists sought updates on the case that was beginning to attract media attention. By 3:30 that afternoon, Detective Dawson was at the university where Marina had studied photography, interviewing Professor Martin Reed in his cluttered office surrounded by framed photographs and student portfolios. Marina had become particularly interested in investigative photojournalism in recent months, Reed explained, adjusting his glasses. She wanted to document stories with social impact. Her last project proposal was about how natural conservation areas, sometimes serve as covers for illegal activities, poaching, drug trafficking, that sort of thing. I thought it was ambitious, but potentially dangerous. Meanwhile, Detective Ramirez sat at Marina's personal computer, scrolling through her recent search history with permission from her parents. What she found sent a chill down her spine. Multiple searches for drug trafficking routes in Florida, and connections between Colombian cartels and Florida operations. Marina had been researching the very activities that the Walsh brothers appeared to be involved in. At 5 o'clock, a local TV station van parked near the operations center at the nature reserve. A reporter with perfectly coiffed hair approached family members of volunteers, seeking interviews about the increasingly mysterious disappearance that was capturing public interest. By early evening, Carmen Alvarez stood before hastily assembled news cameras, her voice breaking with emotion but steady with resolve. "My daughter illuminated every room she entered. She didn't simply disappear. Someone knows what happened at that river, and I won't rest until the truth comes out." The camera panned to show Richard and Patricia Walsh watching the impromptu press conference on their living room television. Richard abruptly switched off the set when Carmen began questioning why some people seem more interested in protecting themselves than finding the truth. Patricia's face remained frozen in an unreadable expression. Later that night, Detective Ramirez interviewed one of Marina's fellow photography students who revealed another piece of the puzzle. She was working on a personal project about how natural areas are used for illegal activities. She had become obsessed with documenting it, though she never mentioned names or specific locations to me. At the sheriff's department, Detective Dawson reviewed Eric Walsh's phone records, noting several calls to numbers with Miami area codes, a region known as an entry point for drugs into Florida. The pattern of calls intensified in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, then abruptly stopped the day after. By 10 o'clock, Dawson and Ramirez met with District Attorney James Wilson, who listened attentively to their evidence but cautioned, "We need more than ambiguous photos and suspicious circumstances to issue search warrants for the Walsh property. Keep digging, but be careful. Richard Walsh has considerable influence in this county." At midnight, Carmen sat in her living room, now transformed into an improvised operations center. Maps covered the walls. Detailed timelines were pinned to a corkboard, and Marina's photos were everywhere. She refused to sleep, methodically organizing information on a large whiteboard, while Javier finally succumbed to exhaustion on the couch nearby. As Carmen sorted through a box of Marina's mementos, searching for any clue her daughter might have left behind, she discovered an old photograph in a shoebox of memories. The image showed Marina smiling with the Walsh twins on a boat 3 years earlier, and in the background, partially visible, was a man Carmen recognized with an icy shock: Rafael Morales, her distant cousin from Colombia, whom the family had cut ties with after rumors of his involvement with drug cartels. Carmen's hands trembled as she stared at the photograph, memories flooding back of family gatherings before the rift, before Rafael's name became synonymous with shame in her household. At 9 o'clock the next morning, she sat across from Detective Ramirez in the detective's cluttered office, carefully sliding the photo across the desk. "This man is my cousin," Carmen explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "We cut contact with him years ago when we learned about his illegal businesses. I never imagined he would be connected to Marina's disappearance." Ramirez examined the photo with a magnifying glass, noting details on the boat that suggested it was taken near the Naples coastline. "Did Marina know who he was? What's the connection to the Walsh twins?" "Marina was very young when we stopped speaking to Rafael," Carmen replied. "She may not have recognized him, but now I wonder if Eric and Dylan somehow knew about this connection all along." By 10:30 that morning, Detective Dawson faced mounting political pressure in Captain Reynolds' office. The captain's expression was grim as he relayed the morning's developments. "Richard Walsh called the commissioner this morning," Reynolds explained. "He's suggesting we're conducting a witch hunt against his family without concrete evidence. The commissioner wants daily updates on this case directly from me." Dawson's jaw tightened. "Sir, With all due respect, the evidence is pointing clearly toward the Walsh brothers' involvement in both drug trafficking and Marina's disappearance. Across town, Detective Ramirez was on the phone with Officer Juan Mendoza of the Colombian National Police, scribbling notes as he provided information about Rafael Morales, suspected mid-level intermediary for the Gulf Cartel, specializing in establishing new routes through the United States. No formal charges, but he's been under surveillance for years. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, a forensic specialist analyzing Dylan Walsh's phone records highlighted a particularly interesting detail: an anonymous call to the police tip line at 3:17 in the morning, 2 days after the disappearance. The call lasted 47 seconds, but nothing was said. The caller remained silent, the specialist explained to Ramirez. But cell tower data confirms the call originated from a location near the Walsh residence. Detective Dawson sat across from Amanda Pierce, Dylan's ex-girlfriend, in a discreet cafe away from the center of Naples. The young woman nervously twisted a napkin in her hands as she spoke. Dylan was always dominated by his brother, she explained. Eric made all the decisions, even ones that affected Dylan's relationships. When Dylan wanted to move in with me last year, Eric somehow convinced him it was a bad idea. Dylan changed overnight, broke things off without a real explanation. At 4:30 that afternoon, a search team with cadaver dogs explored a previously unexplored area of the river, following a new theory about how the current might have transported evidence. One of the dogs suddenly alerted its trainers, digging enthusiastically at a point 20 meters from the riverbank. "We've got something," called the handler, as the dog unearthed a man's wristwatch buried superficially in the soft earth, a Seiko automatic with a customized leather band, partially damaged by exposure to the elements but still recognizable. By 6 o'clock, Ramirez showed photographs of the watch to Carmen, who immediately recognized it. "That's Dylan's watch. It was a graduation gift from his parents. He wore it all the time. It has his initials engraved on the back." Detective Dawson drove to the Walsh mansion in Naples as evening approached, noting how the curtains remained perpetually closed. New security cameras had been installed around the perimeter, and a private security guard now patrolled the grounds, signs of a family circling the wagons. At 8:15 that night, Richard and Patricia Walsh sat stiffly in their formal living room, attorney Andrew Caldwell positioned strategically between them and the detectives. Patricia visibly flinched when shown the photograph of her son's watch, while Richard maintained his calculated composure. "My sons were close friends with Marina," Richard stated, his voice controlled. "We are as devastated as the Alvarez family, but transforming this into some kind of drug conspiracy theory is absurd and defamatory. That watch could have been lost during any of their numerous trips to the river over the years." By 10 o'clock, Carmen was in the newly formed Marina Alvarez Foundation for Missing Persons, a small office space donated by a local businessman. Volunteers helped her organize a candlelight vigil planned for the following evening, the 1-month anniversary of Marina's disappearance. Deep into the night, Detective Ramirez sat at her desk in the nearly empty police station, comparing photographs side by side, the recovered watch, old photos showing Dylan wearing it, and the last recovered image from Marina's camera. Something caught her eye, a detail she hadn't noticed before. In the partially recovered final photograph, the reflection in Eric's sunglasses showed what appeared to be Marina holding her camera in a defensive position, as if backing away. The shrill ring of Ramirez's phone at 2:17 in the morning jolted her from a light sleep. A data analyst had managed to recover more fragments from the damaged memory card, including GPS metadata that revealed something disturbing. After the photos of the argument between the brothers, the camera had moved rapidly to an area 3 kilometers from Blind Point, a swampy region almost inaccessible, known locally as Alligator Graveyard. Alligator Graveyard. The name alone sent chills down Detective Ramirez's spine as she hurriedly dressed in the pre-dawn darkness. This remote, nearly inaccessible section of swampland had earned its ominous nickname for good reason. It contained one of the highest concentrations of alligators in the entire state. By 5 o'clock on September 21st, 2 months after Marina's disappearance, a specialized search team gathered at the makeshift base in the nature reserve, checking specialized equipment for the treacherous terrain ahead. Dr. Marcus Bennett, a wildlife specialist contracted specifically for this operation, delivered a sobering briefing to the assembled team. "The alligator graveyard isn't just challenging because of the predators," he explained, pointing to aerial maps of the dense swampland. "The ground itself is unstable. Patches that appear solid can suddenly give way to deep mud. Maintain safe distance from the water at all times and never separate from your assigned partners." At 7:30, a helicopter lifted off, carrying Detective Ramirez and advanced imaging equipment to survey the area before the ground team's entry. As they flew over the sprawling wetland, the morning sun illuminated patches of still water interspersed among twisted mangroves and floating vegetation, creating a deceptively beautiful mosaic below. Back at the sheriff's department, Detective Dawson faced a much different challenge. Captain Reynolds had called him into a meeting where Andrew Caldwell, the Walsh family attorney, waited with a tight-lipped expression of professional disapproval. "Data corrupted from a damaged memory card hardly constitutes reliable evidence to justify an operation of this magnitude," Caldwell argued, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the practical attire of the law enforcement officers. "My clients are concerned that their sons are being unfairly targeted when there's still no concrete evidence of foul play." Reynolds's face betrayed the pressure he was under as he responded to Dawson. "We're receiving calls from the governor's office questioning the use of resources on this case. Richard Walsh has significant political connections, and they're starting to flex those muscles." By 10:15 that morning, the search team was slowly advancing through the swamp in small boats and on foot in the more solid areas, using long poles to probe the mud and communicating via waterproof radios. The humid air hung heavy around them, mosquitoes swarming despite repellent as they methodically worked through the grid pattern established during the morning briefing. Simultaneously, Carmen and Javier Alvarez sat in the office of Alexander Morgan, an attorney specializing in missing persons cases. The painful conversation centered on options that neither parent wanted to consider. "Florida law allows for a presumption of death declaration after 5 years," Morgan explained gently. "However, given the circumstances, we could petition for an earlier declaration if recovery efforts continue to be unsuccessful." Carmen shook her head firmly. "My daughter is not a legal technicality to be declared away. We need answers, not paperwork." At 1 o'clock, forensic technician Adam Wong made a breakthrough in his laboratory. For weeks, he had been meticulously working with the damaged memory card from Marina's camera, and now his specialized equipment had detected something unexpected. "The camera was in video mode during the final moments," he explained to his supervisor over the phone, his excitement palpable. "The video file was corrupted beyond recovery, but portions of the audio track were preserved separately in the card's memory structure." Wong carefully placed headphones over his ears, connecting his equipment to speakers. The recovered audio was distorted, but certain elements were clear enough. Male voices arguing, Marina's voice saying, "Cannot ignore this," followed by sounds of sudden movement. By 3:30 that afternoon, Ramirez received the audio transmission via satellite in the helicopter, her face paling as she heard what sounded like a muffled scream followed by an impact sound, and then only the noise of running water. The implications were undeniable. They were no longer looking for missing persons, but for evidence of a violent crime. On the ground, one of the search teams made a discovery that seemed to confirm this theory. A small piece of blue fabric, the same color as the shirt Marina had been wearing on the day of her disappearance, according to security camera footage, was found caught in exposed roots near the water's edge. By 6 o'clock that evening, an impromptu press conference had been hastily organized, now attended by national media outlets. The sheriff's department spokesperson chose his words carefully. "We are investigating all possibilities, including homicide." Later that evening, Patricia Walsh sat alone in her car in a supermarket parking lot, seemingly about to call Detective Ramirez. Her finger hovered over the contact on her phone when Richard suddenly appeared, knocking sharply on the window. "What are you doing here?" Caldwell said we shouldn't talk to anyone without him present. Patricia quickly locked her phone screen, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation as she rolled down the window. "Just picking up some groceries," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. In her apartment that night, Ramirez had transformed her living room into an extension of the investigation, with photos and notes covering the walls. She repeatedly listened to the recovered audio, using software to try filtering background noise and clarify the voices, searching for any clue she might have missed. At midnight, Detective Dawson received an anonymous call, jolting him awake. A male voice, trembling with emotion or fear, spoke quickly. "You're looking in the wrong place. It wasn't planned. It was an accident that spiraled out of control." The call ended abruptly before Dawson could respond, leaving him staring at his phone in the darkness. The next morning, when the search team returned to Alligator Graveyard with sonar equipment to examine submerged areas, they made a macabre discovery. Partially buried in the mud, a small metallic object gleamed under the morning light. A necklace with a camera pendant that Carmen would later confirm was a gift she gave Marina on her 21st birthday. And beside it, semi-submerged, what appeared to be clothing remnants, and something the investigators feared was human tissue. The grim discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team. 6 months after Marina Alvarez's disappearance, the partial remains found in the aptly named Alligator Graveyard were positively identified through DNA testing. On January 15, 2009, Dr. Catherine Lee stood before Detectives Ramirez and Dawson in the cold sterility of the State Forensic Laboratory, her clinical tone unable to soften the devastating news. "We've confirmed with 99.8% certainty that the remains belong to Marina Alvarez," Dr. Lee explained, handing over a detailed report. "The occipital bone shows fracturing, consistent with impact against a hard surface. Death likely resulted from cranial trauma, followed by drowning." The silence that filled the room was heavy with the weight of confirmation that transformed a missing person case into a homicide investigation. Ramirez examined the report, her experienced eyes focusing on the technical details that told the story of Marina's final moments, a story of violence rather than accident. That afternoon, Ramirez and Dawson faced perhaps the most difficult task in any homicide investigation, informing the family. The deafening silence that filled the Alvarez home after they delivered the news lasted nearly a full minute before Carmen, standing rigidly by the window with her back to the room, finally spoke. "How long until you arrest whoever did this to my daughter?" she asked, her voice controlled despite the grief evident in the slight tremor of her shoulders. The detectives exchanged a glance, both aware that the case was about to face significant challenges. Later that day, Dawson sat in Captain Reynolds' office, receiving unwelcome news that budget cuts would affect the investigation. "We can't maintain a full team indefinitely," Reynolds explained, avoiding direct eye contact. "Detective Ramirez will continue as lead investigator, but you'll return to the narcotics division on Monday." Dawson's protest died on his lips as he recognized the political realities at play. The department was under pressure to resolve cases quickly, and a 6-month investigation with powerful interests aligned against it made an easy target for resource reallocation. The following afternoon, Detective Ramirez drove slowly past the Walsh family home, noting the freshly installed "For Sale" sign and a moving truck in the driveway. She discreetly photographed the activity from her unmarked car, documenting what appeared to be a hasty departure from Naples. Patricia Walsh emerged hurriedly from the house, carrying a small suitcase, glancing nervously around before entering her car. She failed to notice Ramirez observing from down the street, her behavior indicating a woman under considerable stress rather than someone merely relocating. At 5:30 that evening, Ramirez faced a tense meeting with District Attorney Wilson, who reluctantly explained the challenges ahead. "We need more than circumstances and coincidences. Without an eyewitness or confession, this case will be extremely difficult to prosecute." Ramirez pushed back, pointing to the evidence they had accumulated. "The camera's GPS data puts the Walsh brothers at the scene. We have photos showing drug activity, and Marina's remains show trauma consistent with assault rather than accident." Wilson sighed heavily. "And Richard Walsh's lawyer will argue that's all circumstantial. We need something definitive that ties either brother directly to her death." Meanwhile, Carmen had transformed her grief into purpose. The newly expanded Marina Alvarez Foundation headquarters buzzed with activity as volunteers coordinated search efforts for other missing persons cases across Florida. Carmen spoke on the phone with a producer from a national true crime program interested in featuring Marina's case, while photographs of other missing individuals now covered an entire wall, silent testimonials to families living in the same limbo the Alvarez family had endured for months. Later that night, Ramirez stood in her apartment, staring at the complete evidence board covering an entire wall. Photographs, timelines, transcripts, and arrows connecting events, with the word drugs circled in red at the center. 6 months of investigation had revealed a pattern of activity that pointed clearly to the Walsh brothers, yet somehow they remained just beyond the reach of justice. The following morning, Dawson conducted what would be his final interview on the case before his reassignment. Luke Bennett, Marina's ex-boyfriend, revealed a crucial new detail during their conversation at a local cafe. "Marina sent me a strange message 2 nights before she disappeared," Luke explained, unlocking his phone to show Dawson. "She asked if I still had contacts at National Geographic. Said she had an important story about drug trafficking using eco-tourism routes." This revelation suggested Marina had been planning to expose whatever she had discovered, a powerful motive for someone to silence her permanently. That afternoon, Ramirez visited the bank to review recent financial transactions made by the Walsh family. The records showed Eric withdrawing large cash amounts in the weeks before their move, while Dylan had transferred a significant sum to a newly opened account under the name DW Consulting, likely preparing financial resources for their separate lives. At 2 o'clock, Ramirez re-interviewed Roger, the gas station attendant, who remembered an additional detail overlooked in his initial statement. "Now that I think about it, the twins were arguing when they arrived. They stopped as soon as Marina came back from the restroom." Back at the department, Ramirez examined a page from Marina's notebook recovered from her backpack, finally noticing something written in a personal code in the margin, partially decipherable. E plus D plus RM, cause problem. Confront? The initials matched perfectly: Eric, Dylan, and Rafael Morales, the 3 central figures in what was increasingly appearing to be a drug trafficking operation that Marina had stumbled upon. Later that evening, Javier Alvarez met Ramirez in the empty police department parking lot, handing her a small flash drive. "I found this hidden in Marina's jewelry box. It has password-protected files I couldn't access." At midnight, Ramirez sat alone in her office, finally gaining access to the flash drive after multiple attempts with passwords related to Marina's life and interests. Inside was a folder titled Insurance, containing photos documenting meetings between Eric Walsh and unidentified men at isolated docks, clearly taken without the knowledge of those photographed. The last photo in the insurance folder made Ramirez freeze. A nighttime image dated just 3 days before the disappearance showed Eric Walsh handing a package to a man partially illuminated by moonlight, and a quick search in the police database confirmed his identity: Rafael Morales, Marina's Colombian cousin, known cartel associate, and currently wanted by the DEA for international trafficking. Rafael Morales. The name echoed in Detective Ramirez's mind as she stared at the damning photograph. This connection between Eric Walsh and Marina's cousin, a known cartel associate, transformed the investigation completely. 1 year after Marina's disappearance, on July 20th, 2009, this evidence would finally give the case the momentum it desperately needed. Carmen Alvarez stood at the edge of Peace River that morning, leading a memorial ceremony on the first anniversary of her daughter's disappearance. Nearly 100 people gathered around her, holding photographs of Marina and candles that flickered in the gentle summer breeze. Local news cameras captured the moment as Carmen spoke with renewed strength. "1 year without answers is unacceptable," she declared, her voice carrying across the crowd. "Someone knows what happened to my daughter and to Eric and Dylan Walsh. Today, we remind them that we will never stop searching for the truth." Later that morning, Detective Ramirez sat in a conference room at the DEA headquarters in Miami, presenting her investigation to a small team led by Agent Thomas Reyes, a 45-year-old specialist in cartel operations in Florida. The walls were lined with maps and surveillance photos, many featuring the same players Ramirez had been tracking. "These locations Marina photographed over the past 2 years form a perfect pattern with our suspected trafficking routes," Reyes explained, connecting points on a digital map displayed on a large screen. She was inadvertently mapping the entire operation through her nature photography. Ramirez nodded, the pieces finally falling into place. They used her passion for photography as cover. She had legitimate reasons to visit remote areas that happened to be perfect for drug transfers. That afternoon, Patricia and Richard Walsh sat on opposite sides of the Charlotte County Family Court, avoiding eye contact while their attorneys finalized their divorce terms. Patricia appeared significantly thinner than in previous months, her hands visibly trembling as she signed the documents that would legally end their 28-year marriage. Detective Ramirez, who had been monitoring the proceedings from the back of the courtroom, approached Patricia in the parking lot afterward, away from the attorneys and Richard's watchful eye. "I know you have more to say about your sons," Ramirez said quietly. "What are you protecting now that you're no longer with Richard?" Patricia hesitated, seemingly on the verge of speaking, before noticing Richard's car approaching. "I can't, not yet safe," she murmured hurriedly before rushing away to her own vehicle. By 5 o'clock that evening, the Marina Alvarez Foundation headquarters had evolved into a professional office with 3 full-time staff members. Carmen was conducting a video conference with representatives from missing persons organizations from 5 states, sharing strategies for maintaining media pressure on unresolved cases. Nearby, Javier worked at his computer, updating the Foundation's website with new information about the case, including a section titled Walsh Morales Connection, featuring evidence the police had authorized for public release. The former sales manager had found new purpose in running the Foundation's day-to-day operations, channeling his grief into helping other families. Later that night, in the Lee County Jail, Ramirez and Agent Reyes interviewed Kevin Mercer, a nervous 30-year-old man with multiple tattoos who had been arrested with a significant quantity of cocaine. Mercer had requested a meeting, hinting he had information relevant to the Alvarez case in exchange for consideration in his own sentencing. Eric Walsh wasn't a big deal in the scheme, just a middleman, Mercer revealed, constantly glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to interrupt. But he was moving up, had direct connection to Colombians through some relative of the photographer girl, ironically. Ramirez kept her expression neutral despite the confirmation of what they had already discovered. "Tell us more about your interactions with Eric." Mercer leaned forward, lowering his voice. 2 weeks before they disappeared, Eric was paranoid, said the girl had found something out, that she was threatening to expose him, said he would take care of the problem. I didn't think much of it then, but after the news about them disappearing. At 10:30 that night, Ramirez and Reyes met with Federal District Attorney Sandra Ortiz, presenting the new evidence and connection to larger international trafficking investigations. The 3 sat in Ortiz's office, surrounded by case files and legal reference books. "We have enough for broader search warrants and possibly to locate and interrogate the Walsh brothers," Ortiz concluded, after reviewing their findings. "But still not enough for a formal homicide charge. We need more direct evidence connecting them to Marina's death. Just before midnight, Ramirez received an anonymous email containing only GPS coordinates and a cryptic message. "You still haven't searched in the right place. Not everything was taken by the river." The coordinates led to a location approximately 5 kilometers from the original disappearance site, an area that had not been included in previous search operations. Detective Ramirez immediately contacted Agent Reyes, and by dawn, they had assembled a small team to investigate. When they arrived at the precise location, they discovered an area where the soil had been recently disturbed. After careful excavation to a depth of less than 1 meter, they uncovered a waterproof bag containing what preliminary testing identified as Dylan Walsh's passport, along with a handwritten letter that began with the words, "To whoever finds this, I can no longer live with this guilt. What happened to Marina was..." The incomplete letter trembled in Detective Ramirez's hands as she carefully removed it from the waterproof bag. 3 years after Marina's disappearance, this discovery could finally provide the answers they had been seeking. The forensic team worked methodically around her, setting up portable lights as the morning sun struggled to penetrate the dense canopy above. "The paper is saturated, but portions are still legible," said the forensic technician, carefully placing the letter in a preservation sleeve. "We'll need specialized equipment to recover the full text." By 8 o'clock that morning on August 5, 2011, technicians in the forensic laboratory were analyzing the damaged letter found with Dylan Walsh's passport, using advanced preservation techniques for water-saturated pages. Under careful lighting, portions of the text became clear. "Not meant for Marina to get hurt. Eric lost control when she threatened to expose everything. The push, the fall against the rock, so much blood. I tried to help her, but Eric said she was already dead, that we needed to protect each other." Detective Ramirez stood before the Joint Task Force of Sheriff's Department, DEA, and FBI agents in the conference room, presenting an updated timeline based on the new evidence. Large maps displayed possible locations where Dylan Walsh might be hiding. "We believe Eric Walsh fled to Venezuela through cartel contacts approximately 2 years ago," Ramirez explained, pointing to intelligence reports. Dylan, however, remained in the United States, possibly on the West Coast, based on banking transactions traced from the DW Consulting account. The financial trail had revealed small but consistent withdrawals from ATMs in Oregon over the past 18 months, not enough to trigger automatic alerts, but sufficient to support a modest lifestyle for someone living under the radar. That afternoon, Carmen and Javier Alvarez received the news about the letter in their apartment, now a sanctuary dedicated to Marina, with photographs covering nearly every surface. Carmen touched the cross she wore around her neck as she absorbed the confirmation of what she had long suspected. "We need justice, not just answers," Javier said, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. His once dark hair had turned completely gray in the 3 years since his daughter's disappearance. "Eric needs to pay for what he did to our daughter." Meanwhile, a helicopter from the search team flew over Peace River, where a severe drought had significantly reduced the water level, revealing areas of the riverbed normally submerged. The drought, the worst in Florida in decades, had transformed the landscape, exposing sandbars, rock formations, and debris that had been hidden beneath the water for years. Jason Cooper, a 22-year-old backpacker, hiked along the altered riverbank, photographing the transformed landscape for his travel blog. As he captured images of newly exposed rock formations, he noticed something plastic wedged between stones, a small memory card, which he initially dismissed as trash before deciding to investigate further after seeing a missing person flyer about Marina at the hostel where he was staying. By 5 o'clock that evening, Cooper arrived at the sheriff's station, handing the memory card to the desk officer and explaining where he had found it. The officer immediately recognized the potential significance of the discovery and contacted Detective Ramirez. In the technical laboratory, specialists worked diligently on the damaged card, eventually recovering partial images. Final photographs, clearly showing Eric pushing Marina during an argument, his face contorted with rage. The chronology of the images matched the description in Dylan's letter, providing visual confirmation of the confrontation that had led to Marina's death. At 8 o'clock that night, Detective Ramirez interviewed Patricia Walsh in a Jacksonville nursing home. The once elegant woman now appeared fragile and worn, her physical deterioration mirroring the weight of the secrets she had carried. Richard knew what happened the same day, Patricia finally revealed, her voice barely above a whisper. The boys called him in a panic. He arranged everything, used his contacts to protect them. Patricia reached into the drawer of her bedside table, retrieving a key that she pressed into Ramirez's hand. Storage unit in Tampa, Unit 247. Richard doesn't know I kept copies of everything. The fake passports he obtained, the documents for the money transfer to Venezuela. The following morning, federal agents opened the storage unit in Tampa, discovering a box with meticulously organized documents, including receipts for international bank transfers and false identities created for both brothers. Richard Walsh had left a paper trail of his efforts to help his sons escape justice. Simultaneously, the search team at Peace River, taking advantage of the exceptionally low water level, found remnants of Marina's photography equipment buried in the mud, including a broken tripod with stains that preliminary tests indicated were blood. This corroborates the letter, Ramirez told Agent Reyes as they examined photographs of the recovered equipment. The physical evidence now matches Dylan's description of the confrontation and its aftermath. By 10 o'clock that night, Ramirez and Reyes sat in an unmarked car in Portland, Oregon, discreetly observing a school building across the street. Banking information and facial recognition software had led them to believe that Dylan Walsh, now using the name Aaron Miller, worked there as an art teacher. The surveillance photos showed a man who bore a striking resemblance to Dylan Walsh, though with shorter hair and glasses, changes that might fool casual acquaintances, but not facial recognition algorithms. For 3 years, he had built a new life teaching art to elementary school children, perhaps seeking redemption through working with young people. As they prepared the operation to approach Dylan the following morning, Ramirez received an urgent call from the team monitoring Richard Walsh. He had just hastily purchased a plane ticket to Caracas, Venezuela, and more alarmingly, security camera. Footage from Jacksonville Airport showed that he had made a 12-minute call immediately after checking in, raising fears that Eric Walsh had been warned and might be about to disappear again. "We need to move now." Ramirez's voice carried the urgency of 15 years of investigation as she mobilized teams on both coasts simultaneously. As dawn broke on March 22, 2023, tactical FBI units positioned themselves discreetly around Riverview Elementary School in Portland, watching the staff parking lot for Aaron Miller's arrival. Dylan Walsh, now living as Aaron Miller, pulled his modest sedan into his usual parking spot, a man whose appearance had changed subtly but significantly over 15 years. His once youthful face now carried the weight of his secrets in premature lines around his eyes, his formerly curly hair cut short and beginning to gray at the temples. He immediately sensed something was wrong when he noticed unfamiliar vehicles with tinted windows positioned strategically around the school. For a brief moment, his body tensed as he considered fleeing, his hand gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. But then, as if a great weight had been lifted, his shoulders slumped in resignation. When agents approached his vehicle, he raised his hands slowly, saying simply, "I knew this day would come eventually." 3,000 miles away in Cartagena, Colombia, a similar operation unfolded as DEA agents and Colombian police surrounded a luxury apartment complex where intelligence gathered after Richard Walsh's arrest had led them to Eric Walsh, living under the name Michael Sanderson. The intervening years had been kinder to Eric than to his twin, his lifestyle funded by continued involvement in drug trafficking that had expanded beyond Florida to international operations. Back in Portland, Dylan sat across from Detective Ramirez in a sterile interrogation room, officially identified through fingerprints. The man who had spent a decade teaching art to traumatized children looked simultaneously terrified and relieved. "I've spent 10 years trying to build a life that somehow made up for what we did," Dylan confessed, his voice trembling. "I work with traumatized children, make anonymous donations to Mrs. Alvarez's foundation, but nothing erases what happened that day." As the hours passed, Dylan finally revealed the complete truth about what had happened at Peace River. Marina had discovered everything a week before. She found correspondence between Eric and her cousin Raphael, understood that we were using her photography trips as cover for deliveries. His eyes filled with tears as he described the fateful confrontation. She threatened to expose everything, said she couldn't stay silent knowing the damage drugs caused. Eric became furious, said she was being hypocritical, that her own family had connections to trafficking. Dylan's voice broke as he described the critical moment. It all happened so quickly. Eric pushed her. She fell backward, hit her head on a protruding rock. There was so much blood. I tried to help her, but Eric insisted she was dead, that we needed to protect ourselves. In split-screen precision, as Dylan confessed in Portland, Eric Walsh was being escorted in handcuffs from his Cartagena apartment, his expression one of cold defiance rather than his brother's remorse. The man who had eluded justice for 15 years maintained the same arrogant bearing that had characterized him in the photographs recovered from Marina's camera. "Our father had connections everywhere. Police, politics, judicial system," Dylan explained, detailing Richard's role in the cover-up. "He organized everything. The lawyers, the money, the false identities, Eric's exit from the country. He told me to stay in the United States but change my identity completely, start somewhere new, where no one would connect me to the case." Carmen and Javier Alvarez received Ramirez's call confirming the arrests, with expressions that mixed vindication, relief, and renewed grief at the confirmation of their daughter's fate. For 15 years, they had fought for this moment, transforming their personal tragedy into a mission that had helped countless other families searching for missing loved ones. 1 week later, at a federal courthouse in Miami, the U.S. Attorney announced formal charges against all 3 Walsh men, Eric for second-degree murder, Dylan for accessory after the fact, and Richard for obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. The press conference drew national attention, with journalists who had followed the case for years gathering to hear the details of how justice had finally caught up with the family. 6 months later, Eric Walsh stood in federal court as his sentence was pronounced, 25 years in prison, after pleading guilty in a deal to avoid the possibility of life imprisonment. His appearance had changed dramatically since his arrest, his hair prematurely gray, his face marked by stress, his eyes empty of the confidence that had once characterized him. 1 year after the arrests, the newly expanded Marina Alvarez Foundation inaugurated its national headquarters in Miami. Carmen cut the ribbon, alongside Detective Ramirez and dozens of families who had been helped by the organization. A large portrait of a smiling Marina dominated the main hall. Not the somber missing person photo that had appeared in newspapers for years, but a vibrant image of her photographing a sunset at the Everglades, capturing her spirit and passion. The foundation had become Carmen's legacy, transforming her 15-year search for justice into a lifeline for other families experiencing similar nightmares. As night fell on the day of the inauguration, while guests circulated admiring Marina's work, a curator handed Carmen a small box that had just arrived by mail with no return address. Inside was a memory card they had never recovered and a handwritten note from Dylan. "I found this among Eric's things years ago, but never had the courage to watch it. It might contain what Marina really wanted the world to see, leaving Carmen with the possibility of discovering one final message from her daughter, an ultimate legacy beyond the tragedy that defined her disappearance."